Okay, hello there, and welcome back to the second part of this reading through The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. Today we're looking at the second part, which is called The Game of Chess. I think this is at least for me, the hardest part of the poem, or maybe just the part that gets my head scratching the most as to, why it's there, what it's doing, what its purpose is. And I think that this time of reading it through has sort of helped me see it at least a little bit clearer, but it's still a part that I find difficult, not necessarily because there are lots of difficult words or that the images are too fragmentary or that that it's not painting vivid enough a picture. I mean, I think it is actually one of the most vivid points in the whole poem. The language is great, some of the dialogue going on and the snatches of conversation that we have in this section are really great and are some of the highlights for the whole poem. And yet I still wonder why this poem is, why this section of the poem is here and what its function is. What is it doing that the other parts can't do? And I don't have a definitive answer for that, and I'm not really going to go in and do much of an analysis of this section, but I'll have a few jumping off points. So yeah, I'm going to go into it like that and maybe just play around with a couple of ideas. Now, if you haven't seen the first video on part 1, the burial of the dead, I'll have it linked up in the cards and down in the description. But if you're carrying on from last week, let's get back into it. So this is part 2, a game of chess. A game of chess. The chair she sat in, like a burnished throne, glowed on the marble, where the glass, held up by standards wrought with fruited vines, from which a golden Cupidon peeped out, another hid his eyes behind his wing, doubled the flames of a 7-branched candelabra, reflecting light upon the table as the glitter of her jewels rose to meet it, from satin cases poured in rich profusion. In vials of ivory and coloured glass, unstoppered, lurked her strange synthetic perfumes, ungent, powdered, or liquid, troubled, confused, and drowned the scents in odours. Stirred by the air that freshened from the window, these ascended in fattening the prolonged candle flames, flung their smoke into the lacquer area, stirring the pattern on the coffered ceiling. Huge seawood fed with copper, burned green and orange, framed by the coloured stone, in which sad light a carved dolphin swam. Above the antique mantle was displayed, as though a window gave upon the sylvan scene, the change of Philomel, by the barbarous king so rudely forced. Yet there the nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice, and still she cried, and still the world pursues, jug, jug, to dirty ears. And other withered stumps of time were told upon the walls. Staring forms leaned out, leaning, hushing the room enclosed. Footsteps shuffled on the stair. Under the firelight, under the brush, her hair spread out in fiery points, glowed into words, then would be savagely still. My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak. What are you thinking of? What thinking? What? I never know what you are thinking. Think. I think we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. What is that noise? The wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing. Again, nothing. Do you know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing? I remember those are pearls that were his eyes. Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head? But oh, that Shakespearean rag, it's so elegant, so intelligent. What shall I do now? What shall I do? I shall rush out as I am and walk the street with my hair down, so. What shall we do tomorrow? What shall we ever do? The hot water at 10, and if it rains, a closed car at 4, and we shall play a game of chess. The ivory men make company between us, pressing lidless eyes and waiting for a knock upon the door. When Lil's husband got demobbed, I said, I didn't mince my words, I said to her myself, hurry up please, it's time. Now Albert's coming back, make yourself a bit smart. He'll want to know what you've done with that money he gave you to get yourself some teeth. He did, I was there. You gave them all, Lil, and gave a nice set. He said, I swear, I can't bear to look at you. And no more can't I said. And I think of poor Albert, he's been in the army 4 years, he wants a good time. If you don't give it to him, there's others will, I said. Oh, is there, she said. Something of that, I said. Then I know who to thank, she said, and give me a straight look. Hurry up, please. It's time. If you don't like it, you can get on with it, I said. Others pick and choose if you can't. But if Albert makes off, it won't be for lack of telling. You ought to be ashamed, I said, to look so antique. And her only 31. I can't help it, she said, pulling a long face. It's them pills I took to bring it off, she said. She's had 5 already, and nearly died of young George. The chemist said it will be all right, but I've never been the same. You are a proper fool, I said. Well, if Albert won't leave you alone, there it is, I said. What do you get married for if you don't want children? Hurry up, please. It's time. Well, that Sunday Albert was home and they had a hot gammon and they asked me in to dinner to get the beauty of it hot. Hurry up, please. It's time. Hurry up, please. It's time. Good night, Bill. Good night, Lou. Good night, May. Good night. Ta-ta. Good night. Good night. Good night, ladies. Good night, sweet ladies. Good night. Good night. Okay, so there we have it. That's a game of chess. As I said earlier, this is the section I find probably the hardest to make head or tail of in the whole poem. But there are a couple of things I thought I'd talk a little bit about. The first is the modernity of the poem. Obviously it's there all the way through in all the sections really, and I didn't really talk about it last week. So there are 1 or 2 little bits in this section that at least get me thinking about the modernity and Eliot's speaking into playing with his moment and his moment in time. And there's one word quite early on in this section that just sort of jumps out and feels out of place. It feels very modern compared to the rest of the sort of the words and the mood around it. And it's in that opening bit where it's describing the room of this woman who I'm pretty confident now is the belladonna, the lady of the rocks, the lady of situations from the tarot reading in part 1. And it's the description of her that there lurked her strange synthetic perfumes. I mean, if it was just left as strange perfumes, that would be an adequate description, for what they're like, because they have this strange, almost magical quality on the room and on the fire and on the candlelight. But the word synthetic just jumps out and is so out of place in this section where the language is so rich and almost Elizabethan in its vibrancy. Yet synthetic. I think that's great. I really love that. And then there's a little later on, there's the insertion of a jazz song, the Shakespearean rag, which again is, I mean, obviously Eliot loves Shakespeare, and we'll bring him in a bit every now and then, and so just having that little that little nod there, not only to popular culture but also to Shakespeare, I think, it's something that Eliot just couldn't resist. And apparently, at the very end of this section, the good night, ladies, good night, sweet ladies, good night, good night. This is almost an allusion to Ophelia's last farewell in Hamlet, which again, so that's another Shakespearean rag, almost, a little fragment of Shakespeare. And it's worth noting that Ophelia is another character in literature and who drowned another death by water. So that's just worth having in the back of your head as well. My favourite bit in the whole of this bit is actually just this little bit of dialogue between this lady of situations and this other person. My favourite two lines in the whole thing is, "I think we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones," which is just such a disturbing, creepy, strange little couplet. And I suppose the more I think of it, where the dead men lost their bones, which, the bones are like the last part of the body really to decompose. So it's quite a strange thing just to think about as well. And it gets me thinking again of the wasteland, of the burial of the dead, and what we've had last week. But again, it maybe is referencing its moments with the sort of public consciousness of the time in the wake of World War I, and thinking of the trenches and just the hordes of rats there in the trenches as they filled with water and disease. And so I think there's a bit of an allusion to that going on at the same time. And again, there are a few references to the first part with the "those are pearls that were his eyes," another Shakespearean rag there. So what I think's going on overall in this section of the poem is it's setting up a mood, a sort of state of mind and a state of being that's going to be explored more in the next section. And I think it's got a lot to do with sex and relationships and a certain amount of dissatisfaction across different classes. So you have this very high class, very opulent scene at the beginning, and with our lady of situations, who, at least in some of the criticism that I've read, is viewed as a kind of high class seductress, that this game of chess is almost an analogy for seduction, and it's very slow and ceremonial, but there's a dissatisfaction and a boredom there at the same time, and then that's sort of counterpointed with the gossip in the pub, and it's full of these great lines, like what you get married for if you don't want children, and stuff like that just really hammers home this sense of dissatisfaction, and it's bleak but also funny, and it's definitely one of the most memorable parts of the poem. Okay, so I think that's all I have for a game of chess. I hope you found it at least a little bit interesting, but I'll be back again next week going into the fire sermon, and I'll also be reading Death by Water Part 4 as well, because that's really short. So yeah, until then, I hope you're doing well. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Alright, bye bye.